Okay, welcome everybody to An Accomplished Woman, How a Story Evolves, presented by Jason and Rivkah Panarelli. So a little bit about myself. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and I moved with my family to Israel when I was 7. I grew up in Israel, and I have a degree in theater arts from Tel Aviv University. I returned to the United States in 2003, and I am currently pursuing a degree in accounting.
And I was born and raised in the Bay Area. I went to film school at UC Santa Barbara, and then I worked in Hollywood for a few years. And then I joined the Peace Corps and lived and worked in an orphanage in Bulgaria for 2 years. When I came back to the States, I got into education and did that for a few years. And just a few years ago, I got back into filmmaking, and now I'm a full-time video producer.
In this presentation, we're going to talk about the process of creating the film An Accomplished Woman. I am a huge fan of Jane Austen, and I wanted to get my husband more involved and more educated on Jane Austen. So this last October, we went to the annual Jane Austen meeting in Huntington Beach. And this year they did their first time ever Young Filmmakers Contest. So I thought, this is great. He likes to make films. I like Jane Austen. We'll combine our passions together, and that's how I'll get him involved.
So the call for entry for films had a few criteria. It had to be a maximum of 5 minutes long. The movie could not be longer than 5 minutes. It had to be about Jane or her works. The theme of the conference was Jane in Paradise, so they wanted that somewhere in the film. But it could be any type of movie as far as live action or documentary or even animation. And we chose, so it was open.
I was like, okay, now what do I want to do? Which book do I want to use? Which characters do I want to use? Do we want to do a scene? Do we want to do some mashup of things together? What style do we want? I just was all over the place, and I think every morning I'd wake up with new ideas and new things to do.
Yes, and so there were a lot of ideas, and I said to her, I think a lot of people are probably going to do scenes from the books, because that's the most obvious choice, and let's maybe not do the most obvious choice. And so I asked her, well, why do you love Jane Austen so much? And then she told me her story about how, so Riv is dyslexic, this I knew, but then she told me a story of how when she was a child, she came across Pride and Prejudice, and that really inspired her to push through the dyslexia. And I was like, oh, well, that's our story right there.
So what is dyslexia? It's an auditory and or visual issue. Dyslexia is the general term for disorders that involve difficulty in learning to read or interpret words, letters, and other symbols, but it does not affect the general intelligence. So once we decided the theme of our movie, we went into pre-production. So pre-production is the process of preparing and scheduling and gathering all the elements necessary to create the film. So we didn't know exactly what we wanted to say about this film, but we knew that it was going to be about me, and we knew that it was going to be about Jane Austen, and we knew that it was going to be about dyslexia, and we knew that it was going to be about reading. So that's the elements that we had to start this process. So we started by reaching out to friends and family and seeing what they have, or any stories or thoughts or ideas about this to help us figure out this process.
We started off by sending out just an email blast to friends and family. Jason and I are working on a short documentary project about dyslexia, Jane Austen and me. If you could take the time to answer any or all of the questions below, I would greatly appreciate it. How did you find out that Riv was dyslexic? Do you have any memorable stories about Riv and dyslexia? How did you perceive that it affected her life? How would you describe Riv's connection to Jane Austen? Do you have any stories about Riv and Jane Austen and or her works? And then finally, would you be willing to let us film you for the movie? And so after we got people's answers, we started looking at all the answers, and we used those answers to compile a more detailed list of questions for interviews, for when we would actually sit down with people on camera and have more extensive, in-depth interviews with them. And we started scheduling those interviews with people who were in the area and who were willing to do it. And we also started working on developing a way to record an interview with people overseas, because Riv had a lot of people in Israel that she wanted to interview, and we couldn't just fly there because that's cost prohibitive. So we were trying to figure out a way of doing it through Skype or some other way of recording it over the internet.
We also started looking at quotes from Jane Austen's novels or writings about reading. Here's an example of two. I believe on the 10-pound banknote that just was released has also a quote about reading on it from Jane Austen. And we ended up choosing a different quote, which you'll see later when we screen the film.
After the pre-production process comes production, or principal photography, which is actually filming of the movie. And we filmed family members and Riv as well. We knew we wanted to interview people other than family and friends. We wanted some specialists as well with expert knowledge on the subject. And since I worked in education, I used to work at a school briefly, and so I interviewed the educational care specialists at that school there.
So after interviewing only 7 people, we had over 3 hours of footage for our 5-minute film. And this was really daunting. How do you take all that information and narrow it down to 5 minutes? For me, it was the first time making a film, and I just wasn't sure how do you even start the process of elimination. So Jason said, okay, we need to start editing. We need to see what we have. We need to group it together. We need to figure out what's here, and that's how we can start narrowing this down.
And that led us to post-production. Post-production is the process of manipulating the footage collected during production into a cohesive final product. This is done through editing and adding music and titles and transitions. The first cuts were pretty easy. If people were talking off topic, then we cut that right away. If we had some portions that either had unacceptable audio flaws or video flaws, we cut those right away. So that was easy. We also had quite a bit of repetition that we had built into the process. For example, we might have filmed somebody more than once to get them, perhaps they were kind of stiff and nervous the first time. We're like, okay, that one was a practice. Now let's do it for real. Now you've done it. You've been talking for half an hour. Take a deep breath. Now it's the real interview. Or in a single interview, we might ask the same person the same question multiple times to see if they could answer it perhaps a little more concisely or in a little bit different wording that might sound a little better as a short clip in the film. And so if we had the same person answer the question 3 times, we knew we could cut 2 of those answers right away. And all of these simple cuts they helped, and they got us down to an hour and a half for our 5-minute film.
So we had to start discriminating more. And so we started to look for similarities in answers. So because our pool of questions that we asked our family members and friends were similar, we got similar answers. For example, this is an interview of my parents, each individually, where they had similar questions, and in some cases we got similar answers.
We moved to Israel in '86. She went into the 2nd grade, and she was having trouble reading, and they just attributed that she was a new immigrant. Hebrew and English was confusing and everything.
Okay, so that was his answer, and then
we moved from the United States to Israel. And of course, that's a challenge in itself because it meant learning a new language. And English was secondary, Hebrew was the primary language. So of course, she was challenged in Hebrew, and her English was not progressing.
So you can see
Oh,
that the answers are to the same question, and they had very similar answers. There's no need to have both people answering the same question, especially in a 5-minute movie. So whenever we had the same answer from more than one person, we chose the one that flowed a little better or that spoke a little more concisely, and we did that for all of the interviews.
It was also really important for us to create a balance between the different people we interviewed. We didn't want to have a lot of answers from one individual and a sentence from somebody else. So one of the interesting things that I discovered in the editing software is that we could color code each person that we interviewed. So you could just look at it on a grid and see the colors and see, oh, I have half of my film is one color and then there's just this little snippet of somebody else, and to try to see how we can sort of balance that out a little bit better.
We began to understand that we still have way more footage than we have space for. So we decided that probably we're not going to need to interview anyone else. Probably we can find our 5-minute film within the footage we already have. So we put off the search for more people to interview, and we just really focused on cutting down what we have and getting to the core of what could be a compelling film from the footage that we already had. We started cutting the individual interviews into the specific answers that we liked. And by liked, I mean that they had something to do with our main bullet points. This got us down to 45 minutes.
So now we're in our third round of cuts. And this is where we started placing the answers in a logical order. So we started talking about discovering that I had dyslexia. That is our first point, because that is where the struggle began. Then talking about how it impacted me to understand what was that struggle actually like. And then talking about how Jane Austen comes into this whole story, because the film needs to be about Jane Austen. That's the competition that we were entering. And then we started interspersing the specialists that we interviewed in between our all of the different interviewees that helped either enlighten or support support what was being said in the personal interviews.
We continued paring down. For example, there was a great story from Riv's brother about how she would memorize stories because she couldn't read them herself, but ultimately we had to cut that entire interview.
So one thing that I remember so distinctly is memory. And there was this book that we used to read religiously, regularly, like every night to you. But there was this thing clearly about the mind that you had, the memory that you had, that would never allow me to skip over a word or a sentence or a page, no matter what. Because you had this whole story, word for word, like figured out in your head. And at some point it became sort of like a game. I would see like, what if I just skipped a word? What would happen then? And you had it, like every time you knew exactly what to anticipate. In fact, when the page would turn, you knew what the next page, the storyline that was unfolding on the next page.
So we thought that was an interesting anecdote and a valuable detail for the story, but there just wasn't enough time for that within the 5 minutes. So we had to cut that. We also had some footage, a very nice moment of Riv reading with her nephew that we just couldn't find a place to fit into the film. So that was another thing that was left on the cutting room floor. These cuts got us down from 45 minutes to 30 minutes and ultimately to 15 minutes. It was at this point that the story really started coming together. When we had the 15 minutes of footage, we would actually sit and watch the whole 15 minutes all together, and we would say, well, this is a little less to the topic of Jane Austen, so that can probably go. Or this is, maybe if it was a part of the interview with the educational care specialists, and they were talking about dyslexia that could be both reading and writing or hearing and speaking. Well, hearing and speaking doesn't really apply to her situation, so those answers could go away. Even though they were interesting and relevant, they weren't specifically for this, and we had to make hard cuts, so bam, those things all went away.
So when we got to the 15-minute mark, as we said, the story became clear. I am dyslexic. What is dyslexia? It was discovered late. Most kids, you can discover it already in kindergarten or first grade, but for me, it was discovered much later. I love stories, but I really struggled with reading. And Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen's novel, really helped me push through that struggle with reading. And at that point, we had to make the really hard decisions. If something didn't support that, we had to cut it. And I found that to be very difficult. Because this is such a personal story to me, going through the process of being interviewed and talking about this, everything felt personal to me, everything felt important, everything felt like it needs to be in the movie. And I also never shared this openly in such a large forum. Close friends and family knew, but it was never something that I really shared in such a public way. So it was also it made me feel very vulnerable. So there was a lot of moments in the film that personally I would like to use, but when I took off the cap of this is a story about me and put on the cap as a director of a film, I was able to make those distinctions and say, is it helping the story? Is it helping us make the point that we want to make about this film? And so here's an example of me talking about the struggles of dyslexia that just didn't support our end product. But I just wanted to show you a clip to understand my difficulty in saying, do I keep this in or take it out?
I just felt very frustrated and very angry all the time, and I felt stupid a lot of the time. I remember I would not do homework, or I'd purposely not do homework because I preferred to be considered lazy than stupid.
So it was hard to cut moments like these because I feel like it really helps tell the story of what it feels like to be dyslexic and what that struggle is growing up and being in a classroom where all your peers can read and all your peers can write and they have no issue and you do, and it just does not make sense to a young child. And I'm sure that if we had more time, if we weren't limited to the 5 minutes, we probably would have extended the movie beyond that 5 minutes and elaborated more about dyslexia and that particular struggle. But again, we only had that 5 minutes, so something had to go, and that little part of the interview was not in the end film.
So as a result of these hard decisions, we eventually got down to 7 minutes, almost there. And from 7 minutes, we were able to go into the fine-tuning stage. At this point, we also started to create and gather the elements that would emphasize Jane Austen's role in all of this. We created the opening title sequence with her pages of a book in the background, Pride and Prejudice. We finally made a decision on the quote of hers about reading that we wanted to use in the film, and we had to create a title page that would go in the movie, a title screen. We used and found and used an image of the first page of Pride and Prejudice to emphasize that and the importance of that book in the story. And we also began creating a motion graphic to help visualize dyslexia for the audience, just to kind of help clarify the effect dyslexia has on someone in a visual way. And all of these elements take up time in the 5 minutes, and you have to account for that. And so we knew we had to really dial them in as precisely as possible. During this phase, we also began trying out different music. We originally were thinking of using Regency period music for this, but we found after trying a few different pieces with our edit that more modern instrumental suited the tone of the film better, so we went with that. We started really nitpicking specific sentences and words and spaces between words to determine exactly where to start and stop the interviews or sections of interviews. We decided that 2 quotes that we really wanted in the film but didn't necessarily have to see someone saying could be voiceovers. And so we did a voiceover over the opening title, and then we did a voiceover over the credits, and thus saving us a little bit of screen time that we didn't have to see somebody actually saying those words. They could be spoken over something else that needed to happen. So that saved us a little bit of time that we desperately needed. We had such a tight and exact time constraint that we had to make every second count. We couldn't be wasteful. And so we would literally go through and take fractions of seconds off of different interviews or off of different images to make it all fit into the 5 minutes. And the final product is exactly 5 minutes long, not a fraction of a second longer or shorter.
So until this point, we were just referring to it as the dyslexic movie. We didn't have a title for it. And when we were in this fine-tuning stage, that's when the title came to me. And I was walking home from work, and I remembered there's this moment in Pride and Prejudice. It's in chapter 8. All the characters are at Netherfield, and Mr. Bingley says, "It's amazing to me how young ladies can have the patience to be so very accomplished as they all are." And the rest of the group there starts talking about what truly makes a woman accomplished. So it's knowledge of music and art and language. And then Darcy adds, "And to all this, she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading." And I felt this quote to be really fitting for our film. First of all, it's about how Pride and Prejudice inspired me, and the quote is from Pride and Prejudice, but it's talking about me as a woman and me accomplishing and overcoming my reading barrier.
So we were at this point ready to put on the finishing touches, which was mostly what I did as a filmmaker. That means getting the transitions frame accurate, color correcting the footage. We had a friend of mine come in who's a sound engineer and adjust the levels and all the sound and the equalization and all kinds of things that I don't even understand to make it sound as good as possible. And that got us down to our final product. So our final film, I will now dim the lights and we will watch the movie. And then we will take questions if anybody has any.
Books are a gift. Being able to read is a gift.
You're learning how to read. You have to sound out words, and that can come automatically for non-dyslexics, but for dyslexics, that is an excruciating process.
We moved to Israel in '86. She went into the 2nd grade and she was having trouble reading, and they just attributed it. She was a new immigrant. Hebrew and English was confusing and everything. And then in the 4th grade, they knew that something more serious, so they had her tested and found out that she was dyslexic.
If it goes undiagnosed, it can affect them profoundly because they can't read, and then they notice that their peers are all reading and they aren't reading, so it starts to, they're mostly pretty smart kids, and they notice, oh, why can those kids all read and I can't?
Even though Rivkah was challenged with reading, we read together, we read stories together. And the fact that she loved books and she loved the stories, also it was encouraging for her to say, I'm going to conquer this, I'm going to start reading.
I just love stories so much, but it was such a struggle that the only books that I would read were books that I already knew by heart from the amount of times that somebody would have read them to me. So I already knew every word, and I could sort of, flip the pages and look at the pictures and know what was written on the page.
I think that Jane Austen's books can be entrance books. Usually there's a first book that really taps this idea that reading is a satisfying experience. Yeah, and so I think Jane Austen is a great example of an author that pulls people into the world of literature.
I found Pride and Prejudice in my cousin's room. Just opened it up and I just started reading, and I'm pretty sure there's a lot of words in there that I didn't read correctly, and I'm pretty sure that I pronounced a lot of the names incorrectly in my head as I was reading it, but there was something about it that just captured my imagination, and it made me not care. It made me not care that I couldn't read right. I just enjoyed it, and it was the first book that I feel like I read on my own.
Like for me, I can't imagine living without reading. It's such a big part of my life. But it was certain books that pulled me in, and I think for dyslexics, that connection is even more important because it's just harder work. There's more struggle.
I don't know where I would be if I didn't pick up that book when I was 12. I don't know if there is another writer out there that would have inspired me to just read, because it was so good. It was so good that I forgot that it was hard. To me, reading is paradise, and that is what Austin gave me. She gave me reading.
Well, we're happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Have you shared this in schools?
We have not shared it in schools. We have been asked by,
San Francisco State or University of San Francisco, something like that.
But not, we haven't actively sent this out to schools or.
We didn't really have a presentation around the film. We put that together for today, but if a school wanted to show the film and we could answer questions.
How long did the process take? Because you kept describing about, what you had to do and then you kept having to cut it. So how long did it actually from start to finish?
I mean, it took a while. One, scheduling the interviews. I mean, we tried to do them mainly for my family on the same day, because it was just setting up all the lights and the equipment. It made it easier. I think there were several interviews that Jason filmed me asking me questions, because it was more a free thought of me just going through and talking about my experience and remembering these things. So I think it was about 6 months, I would say, that we.
Sounds about right.
I mean,
we weren't working all day every day, but
it was probably around 6 months that from when we started, that we were starting the project till we got the finished movie.
Sorry, did you have a follow-up on the first?
Just got something from, about CineQuest and how they show the short films at CineQuest.
Oh.
And I'm wondering if that's a place where you could maybe sign.
we'll look into that.
Add some more time to it.
Yes, yes, we did recently submit it to the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival, and we did a little bit of a re-edit, and now it's about 6 minutes. We added in a couple things. We didn't want to sit down and like completely start over because that just felt too daunting. But we knew there were a couple things, like we really wanted to have the definition of dyslexia in there, like on a screen so you can read it, but there just wasn't time. We're like, hopefully people know what it is. Or they'll pick it up from the way people are talking about it. Yeah, that's why we added the visualization of dyslexia to hopefully get that across. But so that's one element that we put into this slightly longer version. But yeah, we've looked into and will continue to look into other film festivals and venues.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I got here a bit late, but did you talk at all about, so what is the process to learn to read when you have this?
Well, I had a special tutor. There's no cure for it. There's no way I will have this with me for the rest of my life. But there's ways to learn and have sort of I'll call them tricks of the trade of how to deal. So first, when I was working with my tutor, part of it is narrowing down what your visual field is. So like having a ruler that you're only looking at one line in the book at a time, so there's not more characters on the page that are distracting you. And even narrowing it down smaller than that, having something that you're really just looking at each word on its own, that's part of the process. There's, I know there's some research that's talking about sort of physical activities that help the brain. So there's a lot of work that is done. I went to a riding school and I'd ride horses, and part of that was to build confidence just in general. Any child that is growing up with some type of disability needs things to make them feel, more accomplished and more powerful. But there was also something about, so when you're learning to ride horses, you're doing a lot of figure eights. And I know that there's a researcher in Israel that discovered there's something about the repetition of the figure eight that helps trigger something in the brain that just stimulates it differently. So there's a lot of things like that. It's also, the more you read and the more you try, you start understanding things from context. So I might not be able to read the full word on the page, but I understand the sentence, I understand the context, so I can decipher what that word should be, especially if it's a word that I know, I just can't read it. Then that's, so it's, I don't know if that answered your question, but yes.
I've got two actually, if you don't mind. I'm wondering whether there are any associated consequences, like maybe being ambidextrous or something. And also, in some of the more emotional scenes, at the end, there's this almost kind of a metronomic scoring, and I'm wondering what was the process in choosing that?
So to your first question, one of the interesting with the educational care specialists, they were talking about how a lot of dyslexics are really good at certain jobs because the way that our brain works differently. I think it was
spatial modeling, like a lot of sheet metal workers are dyslexic because their brains are just able to look at objects from multiple angles better than the average person or the non-dyslexic for whatever reason. Maybe because their brains flip things all by themselves.
So that was one thing that there are. They also, usually dyslexics have a very high intelligence, but they do struggle with, so it's this weird balance of, again, when it's discovered early enough, you can work with the child to sort of overcome and understand the process. The longer you wait, you're sort of missing out on those early years of being able to just say, okay, this is how you have to deal with reading. It is different than, your friend Johnny over here. And then your second question about the music, well, as we said, we tried Regency period music and it just didn't seem to fit the film. And we had different instrumental pieces. It was really trial and error. And it was really trial and error of when do we start. So we had our whole film done, and then we said, okay, we want music in the beginning, and we're gonna want music at the end credits. Do we want music in the middle? Is it gonna be too distracting? is it going to overshadow what's being said? And I think it was just trial and error of.
We knew we wanted music when the climax of the film, basically the end, you know, she's crying, it's very emotional, and we wanted some music to kind of go along with that. And then we didn't want to use the same song over and over and over because I thought that would just be boring and repetitive. So we were trying out different pieces, and at the very, very end, when she said the music kind of stops right on a beat, and then she says, it was so good, it was that I forgot that it was hard.
Yeah.
That was just a happy accident. We were just moving it around, and we just hit play, and it stopped, and we were like, oh, well, what if it stopped just before she said that last sentence? I really like that. And so we just slid it over a little bit, and we're like, hey, look at that. That works right there.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and so sometimes things like that just happen synergistically.
You have a question?
So back to the
Yes, and
editing.
then we'll come to you, and then I think we'll have to end.
Oh, so go ahead and take that question.
It's okay, go ahead.
To the editing, so were there pieces that you knew you wanted? Like, for example, that last sentence where you're like, you forgot how hard it was? Like, that just, like, I want to cry too. Did you know in advance, like, okay, that's a moment we know we want, we know where it needs to be, and we know what it's going to do for the story in these 5 minutes?
I think we knew we wanted it, but there were a lot of pieces that we said we want, and then we got to a point and said there's no room for it. So I think it was just constantly narrowing it down, and finding the moments that really support this journey. And so if it supported the journey, it stayed in as long as it could until it stopped supporting the journey.
And then as far as placing it in the movie, we kind of looked at it like an essay, like, oh, this sounds like an introduction type of answer, or that sounds more like a conclusion kind of answer. So, oh, let's push that to the back and then move it around.
Perfectly
Yeah.
did it. Like, it was like scripted.
Thank you. Yes.
I was very struck by the story about you knowing stories by heart, every single word. And I get the feeling that you might have a really developed auditory sense. So do you hear Jane Austen when you read it? Do you hear the words? Because often people don't read Jane Austen aloud. They miss out on the rhythm and, little jokes and...
I don't know. I will say that one of the things that I really got involved with at a young age was theater, and you would think that it's fun, it's weird to go into theater. I have to learn all these scripts, but once I learned it by heart, that was my goal. Get as fast as I could, off book, and then it was a place where I could express myself, and it would be triggered by somebody else feeding me the line just for me to respond to them. So I think that definitely sort of, I know that in school, it's always much better if I have a teacher that is really good at, a good presenter, that I can hear it. If it's somebody that is writing on the board constantly and I have to take notes, that's when I can't. So I would definitely say that auditory is a better way for me to learn, for me personally.
I was thinking that you might bring something special to reading Jane Austen because you hear things that people that just read the book visually don't get.
Maybe I do. I don't know. I don't know.
All right. Thank you all very much for coming.